It's time for This Week in Science and Education, the internet show that talks about all things health research and science related, new discoveries, new cures. How do we take this information and how do we make it relevant for the teachers and students in today's classroom? We're going to find out next. Stay tuned for This Week in Science and Education. This Week in Science and Education is brought to you by Sheridan Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. At Sheridan, students shine brighter. Visit their website at SheridanShineBrighter.com. It's time for This Week in Science and Education. This is episode 46, How Children's Brains Work, recorded Tuesday, June 14th, 2011. Hey everybody, this is your host Kevin Cougler from Virtual Researcher on Call. Glad you took the time to join us today. We've got an interesting show today. We're going to find out, how do children's brains work? I'm sure that's the question on everybody's mind. To answer that question, we have a special guest today, Dr. Kim Roberts from Wilfrid Laurier University. Hi Kim, how are you?
Hello, I'm good, thank you.
Thanks for taking the time to join us. Also joining us today is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Thomas Merritt from Laurentian University. Good morning, Thomas.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good night. And speaking of good nights, I don't know where this is going, but Jeff Brown is filling in for us today from the Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board for our good friend Colin Jago. Hi, Jeff. Thanks for filling in today.
Yeah, good morning.
I don't know where this show is going. We're off to a poor start, and it's all my fault. So, Kim, I'm going to look to you to rescue me at this point. Kim Roberts is a researcher and scientist over at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And Kim, tell us a little bit about your research and what it is you do at Wilfrid Laurier.
Okay, well, I am a psychologist, and I'm not at all involved in any clinical work. There's another type of psychologist who's a researcher. So I am a researcher. I'm fascinated by children and how they come to the conclusions they come to, how they behave in certain ways, how the environment they're in affects how they behave, how the relationships affect how they behave. I just find them fascinating. They're so much more upfront with you than adults are, because they haven't, depending on their age, they haven't yet been socialized. And so, they tell it like it is. And that gives you a really nice insight into how their brains work. And they really have a logic all of their own. So, for example, when I'm teaching people about child development, one of the examples I use is when my son was in preschool, one day he had a fire drill. And, that can be really stressful for kids. So when I saw him later on, I asked him, anything unusual happened today? Is there anything you want to talk about? No. Well, did the fire alarm go off? No. And then later on, after dinner, he starts talking about it was so cold outside and the teachers had to go and get our coats. And I said, but you told me the fire alarm didn't go off. And he said, no, Mummy, it didn't. The fire alarm went on.
Interesting. I like it.
That's
Why
right.
did he say that, Kim?
It's totally logical. We turn lights on, we turn the bath water on. When we turn something off, it stops. Yeah. And so it's completely a learned thing that adults like us say the fire alarm went off. It's not logical. There's no sense to it. It's just that somewhere, sometime, someone decided, hey, let's say the fire alarm went off, and that's how we'll talk about it. But it's completely logical.
The other thing that strikes me with a 2.5-year-old is the complete honesty that they have. Mm-hmm. Little Johnny will be over as his playmate, and he'll come upstairs and he'll say, Benjamin hit me, and I'll say to Benjamin, fully expecting him to lie, Benjamin, did you hit little Johnny? Yes, Daddy, really hard. Wow, okay, I guess I'm not doing a good job on consequences, because you should be maybe not telling me that, but you are, so it's really quite fascinating.
That's right.
Over to Thomas now. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry,
Kim.
I was just going to say, you brought up something really interesting, because children's understanding of deceit and lying is something that develops very, very gradually. So young children don't tend to tell the same lies, or certainly don't tell them as convincingly as older children, which is interesting because people often think the reverse. People often think that 3- and 4-year-olds will make up these wondrous stories, and they do, but they can't really convince you because they don't understand enough about how the mind works. Another example is a little girl come up to you and says, "I didn't go in the cookie jar," completely out of the blue.
That wasn't a little girl, Kim. That was Thomas.
That might have been.
I see. It's hard to tell him apart from a little girl. Is that what you mean?
Really?
No, not at all.
With that. Not where I thought we were going. No,
Yeah.
but that's.
Well, I've worked with a lot of kids, and I've yet to find a little girl with the same kind of facial features.
Though he does
But
have
we
the
all have
earrings
earrings.
going on. Yeah.
May I ask you a science? May I ask a science question?
Please
You
do.
may.
In the. Okay, am I the only one hearing a dog
No,
bark?
Does
it's
anybody
my
hear a
fault.
dog?
There's a dog in the background, and I'm going to try to shut down. It's because we have a gentleman here who helps
Colin's
to train seeing eye dogs, and he brings the dogs in for socialization around all the people, but sometimes Wham will decide she wants to say something to us. So I'll try to go ahead and mute it, but I'm not used to this technology on this end, so I'm suffering with the muting.
I'm just glad I'm not hearing things. Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah. Kim, I was really interested looking through the little bit of background information that we had on you, the idea of the brain rewiring as part of childhood development. And going back 20 years when I was an undergraduate, there was a lot of controversy as to how much the brain, or at least in my understanding, there was a lot of controversy of how much the brain did rewire and change. And I can remember reading early studies on canary brains. And they were looking at bird song, and the canary brain changes in a seasonal cycle along with song. And so male canaries are singing more at a particular time, and so parts of the brain were actually rewiring through time. I do a lot of work with people that have brain injuries in sport outside of my life in science. And it's interesting to talk to people whose brains are rewired because of an injury. What do we know about changes in brain wiring and how the brain works as children develop? And does that tell us anything about how brains recover from traumatic injuries? And those are a couple of really big questions, so break them up as best you can.
Right, yeah. I mean, certainly the nature versus nurture debate has been huge. And 20 years ago, we all believed that, everybody believed that there was some interaction between genes and the environment. It can't be all one. It can't be, one or the other. And it's recently, actually, I would say in the last maybe 6 or 7 years since we've got better, the techniques have got better for actually looking at the brain. So I'm thinking of things like functional MRI and so on, where you can have people do tasks and you can actually see which parts of the brain are lighting up. So that's been very helpful. I would say now that the feeling amongst the academic community is that environment actually has a much bigger effect than we ever thought it did. I've seen brain scans. Some of the work I do is taking the principles of child development to police officers and social workers who are involved in investigations of children. And I've been shown pictures of, a 8-year-old's brain, what it would look like with an MRI scan, and then the brain of a child who was severely neglected. And the difference in the size of the brains is astonishing. So certainly, with whatever capacity we're born with, your experiences can help or hinder your brain development.
So how much of that could be nutritional and how much of that can be experience? And because I have a 1-year-old daughter at home, and if you give me any more stories like that, I will openly weep on air. If we could move into the positive side and away from the negative side. So, are there things that I can do to help my daughter's brain develop? So my wife tells me that I shouldn't watch SportsCenter with Lila on my lap and make her go through the hockey highlights. Is that true? Should I be doing other things that are more interactive instead of showing her that Tim Thomas is in fact the best goalie who has ever pulled a mask on?
Oh, really? Tim Thomas, huh? I think one thing that's very, very important for young children is not so much that, they have to have exposure to this type of experience, like, they have to see sight words every day, or they have to they have to do jollyphonics every day. I think the breadth of experience is just as important, because what happens is that things drop out. So the brain will just lose it'll atrophy. Your brain will atrophy if you're not actually using parts of the brain that you don't need, which is very efficient, really, and sort of, thinking of Colin and the adolescents that you mentioned before about whether their brains work. And they're actually going through a phenomenal pruning of the brain, because by the time you reach adolescence, parts of the brain you haven't used, it's likely that you're not going to use those parts. And so the brain will literally reabsorb all of that you don't use, but it helps what you do use. It makes it stronger. And that's one of the reasons they say why adolescents change in their circadian rhythms. So they go to bed later and they wake up later. And it's not necessarily laziness. It's just that because of all of this restructuring that's going on in the brain, it has its effect in the circadian rhythms, which is why we actually do high school completely wrong, because we tend to take the older kids earlier and earlier, and it should be later and later. Yeah. I'm
sensing a segue over to our good friend Jeff Brown, who was talking about this very issue before we went live. Jeffy, I'm sure you want to jump in.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. Like I said, there's some of the choices we do make in education. I think we're starting to understand how the brain works, but we have systems in place that have been around for a long time that come from before that stage in the game, right? We have these systems around, like the buses leave early, and it's best to give the older kids some dispensation. You have to go earlier because the younger kids, we don't want to let those little guys on the bus so early, although knowing from my teenagers, they really don't turn their brains on until around 10 o'clock in the morning, and even then it's only for a short time. But having said that, how do we do, has there been any work done or any kind of studies done or any kind of experience you've run into where we have actually seen schools try to restructure based on our new knowledge around how the brain works, or our school boards and so on just still a little bit too much stuck in another century?
There has been a few studies, and the emphasis is on the few. I would say 3, maybe 4. Most of them have been in the US, and there have been positive results, certainly in terms of families' experience. So the teenagers themselves and the parents of the teenagers have found it all very positive. There is one school in Toronto, I think it's Bluevale Collegiate, who has actually put this system in place and has changed the start time to a little bit later. But you're absolutely right, like this doesn't fit with our normal day-to-day routine. If teenagers can't get themselves to school for a certain time, the parents might be at work by then, and how do we deal with that? So it definitely is, a big change, but I'd be quite interested to see how it might help. Yeah.
There's one other thing that's come to my mind, and it was kind of, as we were talking about the youngsters, the really young kids, and them not having really a filter about, how to judge what they say. And obviously they gain that filter as they go along. My issue is the development of that filter that we often maybe call a socialization, that whole filter process of knowing how to say what. Is often maybe negative. We go ahead and we teach kids to lie a little bit. If you're not going to get the same retributions if you're very, very good at covering your tracks. It seems to be an imbalance that, as an educator, it's really hard to figure out in a classroom. Have you had any experience at all around how to deal with that kind of dichotomy at all, but as we develop the kid, as they go forward?
Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. There are social lies that we train children to do, and it's the interests of being nice to somebody else. But you're absolutely right that, we do teach them to tell these little white lies, and, it's very confusing for children because they're normally at the early age taught that, you don't lie, you tell the truth. But the thing is, they're all very abstract concepts, like the truth. What is the truth? I mean, I would have enormous trouble being able to say that in simple language, what the truth is. It's actually what children used to be asked in court before they were allowed to testify. So, you have 4 or 5, 6-year-olds being asked, do you know what the truth is? Can you define the truth for me? Fortunately, that's gone now. There was a bill introduced about 2 years ago where children are now assumed to be competent to testify, and then it's up to the defense to prove otherwise. But yeah, it's very confusing for children. And there's also some really interesting cultural differences as well. So in the Western world, we're so individualistic, and most kids, most school children will lie if it means they'll avoid punishment, or, they'll save their own bacon. And it turns out that in Eastern societies, so some of the research I'm thinking of was done in China, those kids don't do that. They will not lie to save their own bacon, but they will lie if it means they do something helpful for the group, right? So they're much more collectivist culture, and they're not used to having themselves be the center. It's the group that's the center. That's how society is structured. And so I find that very interesting as well, how you can get quite different behavior. One other thing that sort of sprung to mind when you were asking your question is lying is also a skill. It's seen as, bad. It's seen as immoral behavior. We most of the time discourage it, but it's actually a skill, because to lie convincingly, just think about what you need to do to lie convincingly. First of all, you need to know that the person you're talking to is thinking something different to you, right? You have to know that they're capable of thinking one thing while you're actually thinking another. And actually, 3- and 4-year-olds don't get that. They think that whatever they know about the world, everybody knows about the world. So when you ask them a question like, what did you do today? It's kind of a very strange question, because, well, you know what they did today. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that, you have to construct a story that's believable. So you have to know about what things are plausible and what things aren't. And of course, if you're still in that children's logic, the fire alarm went on. That's very difficult. And then you need to be able to monitor the lie, so you can, look at whoever you're talking to and see, do they look like they don't believe me? I have to add in some more details, and you have to know what convincing details are for a lie to be believed. And then you also have to sort of control your own behavior physically, your face, what you do with your hands, all of that kind of stuff, to lie convincingly. So, if you have a child who's 6, 7, 8, and you don't know that they've ever been deceitful, I would look into that a little bit more and see, what are the reasons for that? Are they just very kind of, are they very faithful to the not lying rule, or maybe is there something else going on that needs to be looked into?
It's really important to have a good backup these days. We all have information that we want to protect, and we want to make sure that we can retrieve. There's a lot of stories, and I'm much of a culprit as anybody on this, that we just don't have adequate protection anymore on our computers. We seem to be so busy with our lives that we don't take the time to sit down and set up an appropriate backup. Documents, pictures, research, all sorts of things that we have on our computers, and we've got to make sure that it's protected. Well, how are we going to do that? Why don't you give Mueller Systems a try? Their website is muellerdata.com/VROC. That's muellerdata.com/VROC. If you visit that website, free for 90 days, you can download, install, and configure their software. Make sure that it works for you. If you get stuck or you're not sure how to do it, give them a call. They'll walk you through it. Again, that website is muellerdata.com/VROC. We thank them very much for their support of our podcasting programs at Virtual Researcher on Call, and we look forward to working with them some more in the future. muellerdata.com/VROC. Get that data protected, folks.
We're talking today with Dr. Kim Roberts from Wilfrid Laurier University, psychology, talking about how children's brains work. This is really fascinating. Kim, I have to ask you, do you have a family of your own? And if you do and you have children, are you the world's most perfect mother because you can analyze every step of the way what's going on with them?
Okay, my response to the first question, yes, I do have children. I have a 9- and 6-year-old who are completely different, black and white. Answer to the second question, am I the world's best mom? I'd like to bring my kids in so you could ask them, but no, I'm
surprised. I invited them, actually, and they're coming in right now. Okay, we really did. Sorry.
Yeah, it's funny. They sometimes ask me to stop playing psychologist with them.
I bet they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tom, back over to you.
So, Kim, another thing I was really interested in looking at the brief bio that we had and scrolling through your webpage was the idea of contaminated memories. And that's something, the rewiring and brain development is something I have thought about in the past, but the idea of contaminated memories I didn't know about. So can you tell us a little bit about what we know about why that happens, or what is a contaminated memory, and then B, what do we know about this? Why is it happening? Why, what's missing or what's working? What's driving that?
Right. Well, we talk about the information age. We talk about a knowledge society, and it's quite a good description, really, because if you think of all the places where you get information from, you have your own experience. You might watch television. You might look, I see my web pages up there. You might look at web pages. You might read books. There might be an instructor who gives you some information. There might be peers who give you, their take on things. So we actually get information from a lot of different sources. And if you think of it from an educational perspective, what you really want to do is to integrate all of those different sources so that you build up a knowledge base. And of course, that will work very well as long as all of those sources are credible. Now, we know from other work, some of the more forensic work I've done, that children's memories get contaminated in the sense that they might experience an event, they might watch something on television, it might be very relevant to what they've experienced, but it might distort their memory a little bit. Or somebody might suggest something to them. Let's say a child makes an allegation that they're being harmed, and a parent or a teacher interviews them, as you would, because that's extremely concerning. But if it happens that the people who are doing that informal interviewing give suggestions, and the suggestion can be something as simple as, was it the guy who came into the room first? Was he wearing a blue shirt? Did it happen in the classroom or was it in the gym? Like even those types of questions, which people use a lot when they're trying to get information from children. Children might then sort of incorporate this into their memories, especially if their memories aren't very strong. So, maybe it did happen in the classroom, but they start remembering it as if it happened in the gym. And from a forensic point of view, this is a very, very bad thing because obviously it can't be corroborated. If the event did happen but they got the place wrong, then alibis become very important at that point. And so it is very, very difficult in the justice system because it wasn't designed with an understanding of child development in mind.
So before you go on, let me just ask us a question about that. So let's take that particular case. So you're interviewing a child and you have inadvertently placed this idea that maybe the event happened in the gym. Is that now irrevocable? I mean, does that child now remember that as an event that happened in the gym? So what do we know about, or do we know? Is there any way to know that?
We know. Sorry, we know a few things. If suggestions are repeated over and over and over and over, and the child does take those suggestions on board, so say the suggestions came from somebody credible like a parent or a teacher, and they're repeated over and over, then they do tend to become as strong as the memories of what actually happened. If it took place one time, it might drop from memory. So we did a study that gave very counterintuitive results. So we had children who took part in an event, and then they had a suggestive interview a while after when their memory was, starting to fade. And then the next day, they had another interview. And that was the very worst scenario for children's retention of suggested information. And we think it's because the memories of the suggestions are fresher than their memories of what actually happened.
Right.
We did the same, but with a group that, they had their event, they had their biasing interview, their suggestive interview, and then they weren't interviewed until a long time after that, and they weren't as suggestible.
Yeah. Because
then the memories of the suggestions had also faded. So it's kind of interesting because we know that memories do fade over time, and that is a very reliable finding. But at the same time, if things happen, it can bump up your memory or reduce it depending on what those experiences are.
I was just going to ask him one quick question, whether this is something that is just totally in the world of children, or now if you have the same kind of suggestive process done to an adult, does it carry on through your lifetime? It's maybe an interesting thing for us to find that description between the two.
Yes, no, it is adults as well. Some of the examples that I wrote in the abstract was you might find yourself telling a joke to someone, and you're halfway through and you realize, oh, this is the person who told me this joke in the first place, right? Or you may be confused between, did I really win the lottery or did I just dream that? There's lots of decisions that we actually have to make about the sources of our knowledge. Who said something to you? Was it this person or was it this person? So we're constantly making these, we call them source monitoring decisions, because you're really keeping track of where the information comes from. So for sure, adults make these kinds of errors as well. And there's some evidence that, as you sort of get to the senior age, that then you tend to do it a little bit more. You remember what happens very well, but not where the information came from. And the difference with children is that it tends to happen more with children. And especially children in the 3 to 6 year old range, so like that preschool range. And a lot of that is to do with brain development. Like, we believe that source monitoring decisions take place or are highly influenced by the frontal lobe. So this is the parts of the brain that actually develops in those preschool years. You're not born with this highly developed frontal lobe. It goes through some, really key changes in that preschool period. And until that's developed well, then it becomes very difficult to make these high-level decisions about where things came from. It's not necessarily a memory problem. Like, we have children who have fantastic memories. Everything they're saying is true, but what they're doing is they're taking a little bit of information from one event and a little bit of information from another, and it gets all jumbled up. It's all true, but it didn't all happen in that one time. It came from a bunch of different experiences.
So it's then, as an educator, oftentimes when we have an event happen in a school, and we have the children come in to talk to us about their perceptions of what went on, that we shouldn't maybe jump to the conclusion that student A is lying if student B and C have a different story. I think this happens now. If they all come into the principal's office and get asked the questions about what went on, there may be it may not truly be a lie. It could be a misperception or misunderstanding of how they put their knowledge together that created that difference. Because oftentimes principals will use that as a way to say, okay, this is the one that's telling them the untruth, right? So maybe it's something we could definitely use in a school.
Yeah, and also, one thing that's very common, and with adults you see this quite commonly as well, is that somebody will hear something. So it might be gossip, it might be a rumor, it might be what a witness told them happened. But then when they relay that information that they've only heard, they make it sound as if they had first-hand experience. And if they didn't, then they're not being clear about the source and where it came from. And they might even forget the source altogether. Like, it may not even be confusion. It might be just complete source amnesia. And it tends to be that if it's a situation where source doesn't really matter, then you will let go of that. The brain lets go of stuff it doesn't need. So yes, yeah, I think certainly in bullying situations, it would be very helpful to know, did you actually see this? Where were you when you saw it? Or did you hear this, and who did you hear it from? And try and unpack it that way. That's what the police often do as well with children, because they often need to know, is one parent coaching the child to make some allegations against another parent? It's very similar.
Well, the name of this show is This Week in Science and Education, and so I think that an experiment or a study would be in order, but I am looking for a lab rat. Let's see, who would be a good lab rat? Thomas, thank you for volunteering. Kim, on your website, you have something here called a sample study, and I'm just going to get Thomas to take the sample study here and see how well he does. Can you see that, Thomas?
If I say no, do I get out of taking the test?
No, I'm afraid not. And no, the dog didn't eat your homework and all that kind of stuff. So
Yes,
if you can't
I can see
read
that.
this, what I need you to do is to memorize this picture. Let me know when you think you have it committed to memory, and then we'll proceed with the study.
Okay, hit the next button.
Okay, here we go. So question number 1, how many people were there in the picture?
9.
Way to go. Wow. See, already he's doing better than I did. Question number 2. What color parts was the first woman on the left, front row, wearing? What color pants? Sorry.
Hopefully you mean pants. Yeah. No, see, I'm afraid I can't answer that. I've been taught not to look below the neck. It's all about eye contact. And so the last thing I'm going to do is tell you what color her pants were. I think it was the woman on the right that had a big green bar across her sweatshirt. But
well, here's
pants
one.
I don't got.
Okay, well, here's a different one then. So here's above the waist. What color shirt was the woman on the far right wearing?
My right or your right?
You're right.
Okay, and what are my options? Because they're actually behind the bar there. I've got black, gray, and...
Black, gray, white, and blue.
I think it was white and blue.
White and blue? Well, we'll say white. Oh, sorry, that's incorrect. Let's go for blue. Sorry, that's incorrect.
I got nothing.
Gray. Ah, she was wearing gray. Last question for you, and then we'll get Kim to spin this and tell us why this is important.
How many people were wearing glasses?
How many people were wearing glasses? None, 1, 2, or 3.
Out of 9, it's got to be 3.
That's a guess. See, that's a guess. You're going with the odds there. That is incorrect. 2,
I got nothing.
That's incorrect. 1, that's not correct. None. None.
See,
okay.
if you'd asked me if these were fruit flies, I'd have done better.
Well, you did. Well, not that it's any consolation, but you got way more right than I did. So, Kim, tell us a little bit about that study. What were we looking at there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, with fruit flies, at least you can breed them. Right, so one of the things with those questions, I mean, first of all, it's just, plain memory. How good is memory as an eyewitness? And usually the answer is not very good. Even people that were involved might pay attention to certain parts of things and really not be very bothered about who was wearing glasses and that kind of thing. Normally you remember the actions, what actually happened. And the other part of it was the question, let's take the second one, what colour pants was the woman on the left wearing? And all of the responses were incorrect. So you could click on any one of those 4 responses. They were all incorrect because she wasn't wearing pants. She was actually wearing a skirt. But the question,
we set you up.
right? But the question is framed in a way that it almost assumes what colour pants was the woman on the left wearing. So it's not up for, you're not being asked, was she wearing pants? That's not up for debate. You just want to know what color pants she was wearing. And this is how suggestions can kind of contaminate our memories, because there's lots of things we assume in the world, and we don't even know we're assuming them, like the fire alarm going off, for example.
Kim, I was going to interrupt just for a second before we lose this thought. They run away from me these days. Is that then kind of an indication that people always want to be right? We always want to fit in there and get the right answer. So in that case, sometimes we will give a truth that is maybe not a truth in order to the point that we may be considered to be correct in our assumptions.
Mm. That's interesting. I haven't thought about that. I mean, certainly from a very young age, we're asked questions, and the person asking the question usually knows the answer. So, I knew a fire alarm had gone off when I was asking my son about it. In schools, if a teacher, and you'll know this, if you ask a child a question, a factual question or a math question, you normally know the answer. And if the child gets the answer wrong, you kind of give them the, "Are you sure?" And then they change their answer. So they're socialized into this whole, this person knows the answer. Adults know the answers when they ask me questions. And if they ask me a question again, it means I gave the wrong answer, so I have to change my answer this time. So I think that definitely, there really could be something that's very rewarding about being right all the time, because we're sort of raised like that, really, until we leave high school. And now, what was the other part of the thought? All right, I just wanted to refer that back to the criminal justice system again, because when a child sits down with a detective, the detective doesn't know what's happened. That's the point of interviewing the child. And it's really important that the detectives let children know, I was not there that day, I don't know what happened, in an attempt to try and sort of let the child know that in this particular situation, you, the child, are the expert. You're going to do the talking, the interviewer is going to do the listening.
Kim, that reminds me actually of a joke. Are you guys up for a joke? Because the whole pants thing about pants on or off, I actually have a joke around that. Don't worry, Thomas, you're safe on this one. This is an old joke. It's 20 years old. Jeff flew the coop for a second. He's going to be sorry he missed this one, but it is relevant, trust me. So the joke goes like this. So there's a plane that crashes on the border between Canada and U.S., and when that happens, where do you bury the survivors? You guys heard that one before? Thomas doesn't know. Kim, do you know?
Have you told us the punchline already?
Well, the punchline is, I guess it's more of a riddle. Neither place, you don't bury survivors.
Right. Darn it, I had heard that. Yeah.
So that kind of goes to what you were saying, the pants thing there.
Yeah.
And you'll be sorry you missed that.
Sorry, the other one is a surgeon has to operate on a person, and the surgeon says, I can't operate on this person, he's my son. But the surgeon wasn't the boy's father. How can you explain it?
I've heard that one too. Jeff
Remember
knows.
that
Jeff.
one?
It's his mother.
It's his
because
mother.
of our beliefs in certain sexes doing certain things, right? That we feel that would be the answer. Yeah.
Right. And it's things like that actually where adults. It's one instance where adults are more suggestible than children, when it's to do with general knowledge about the world and that kind of things. Like I have a study where I was interviewing very little kids, like 3- and 4-year-olds, they're barely talking in complex sentences. And they were talking about a scenario where a nurse had given someone an inoculation. And all of the adults in the study, in the control group, when I asked them what was the nurse wearing, they all got it wrong because they all said a white uniform. And it wasn't white, it was maroon. And none of the kids said that because none of the kids have that general knowledge, right, that a nurse typically wears a white uniform. And all of the adults had reconstructed their memories so that in their mind they saw a nurse with a white uniform on.
Interesting. Well, we've come to the time to wrap up the show for today. I'm afraid we're getting to that point, but I do want to give both of these gentlemen a chance for a last question or comment. Let's start with Thomas. Looks like he's thinking. Let's start with Jeff.
Actually, I was thinking too.
Very well
You hide it well.
I did have one more question then, really. In the justice system, we still go with, it seems to be, and maybe this is where I'm making a misconception, that we still seem to go with the eyewitness as the key message to find someone guilty or not guilty. Hopefully not. Has there been enough understanding in the justice system developed, work like yours and other people's, that perhaps we need to look at other evidence equally as well as an eyewitness, or is it still the card to hold in your hand?
Yeah. I think in terms of eyewitness identification, so, picking someone out of a lineup, I think the message has got through quite a bit that, if the alleged perpetrator isn't in the lineup, the person might pick someone, or you might be saying, well, it might be number 2, I'm not sure, and then somebody says, that's it, you got him. And we know that there's quite a lot of cases now that the convictions have been overturned because it was proven, and a lot of it is with this new DNA evidence and a lot of the more basic science methods. We do realize that eyewitness identification is somewhat problematic. In terms of children, you see, when the kinds of allegations children make, so it's usually they're making allegations that someone's physically harming them, someone's sexually abusing them, and that becomes very difficult then because usually the only witness is the child. There's usually very little physical evidence to use because they may not disclose until 6 months afterwards. And usually any physical evidence disappears in the next day or two. So there's very, very little to go on, and usually the main evidence is the child's statement about what happened. The perpetrator usually says it didn't happen, and they were the only 2 people there. And so all they've got is the child's eyewitness testimony.
Thomas, last question, comment goes to you today.
I wonder how much we know about variation between children. I mean, you were talking about sort of broad patterns, but I'm assuming there's an enormous variation between children. And whether we can use variation between children to try to identify kids that may have some sort of learning disability or memory disability, that is it possible to work with kids, identify things early, and then work to try to strengthen memory, strengthen cognitive ability?
Right. I mean, certainly there are lots and lots of studies training children to use particular memory strategies. And you can probably train children things like that from about age 5 to 6, kind of like when that formal schooling starts. The problem is, even if you train children in strategy, they also have to know when confronted with something where that strategy is helpful, they have to know which strategy to use, and they have to be able to use it independently then. And so it's really not until they get all of those things that it will help them. So yes, they can be trained. So if they're in a highly structured situation where, let's say, a teacher is saying, remember how we did it this way? You can do this task the same way. That's possible. Right. But just sort of putting them in cold and having them choose the strategy, you're really looking more at 8, 9, 10-year-olds to be able to do that. There was something else I wanted to say. Oh, right, you were talking about variation among children. Yeah. I think that's really one of the next steps that we have to get into about, instead of seeing this as kind of a nuisance in the data, to actually grab hold of it and see, what are these differences? And one of the reasons why children are identified for learning disabilities so late, and again, you have a much better expert in the audience than me to talk about this, is because it's not always apparent until children get older when they need to use more complex skills like reading or source monitoring, making judgments about their own memory, and when they need to put strategies in place. Like, they're all quite high-level skills. And so it's at that point that you realize, they haven't got there. So they've got sort of the things that you'd normally develop before then, but at that point it becomes apparent that this child needs more support.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Kim Roberts is a professor of psychology at Wilfrid Laurier University and joined us today for a fascinating discussion about how children's brains work. I think we're all enlightened. I know Thomas and I are going to go home and try and put into practice some of these strategies and see if they work for us. And if not, Kim, where can we get a hold of you to, maybe help us further?
Well, you can always Google, and my email is kroberts@wlu.ca. The lab website is www.childmemorylab.com.
Super. Well, thanks again, Kim, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. On behalf of Dr. Thomas Merritt from Laurentian University and Mr. Jeff Brown from the Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board, this is Kevin Cougler from Virtual Researcher on Call saying thanks again and have a safe and happy week, everybody. See you again same time next week. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Thanks for coming on.